So let's make sure we can update a place. For that, when we go to update place, we want to retrieve that place by ID. And at the moment this fails because I worked with dummy places thus far, and in there we can't find a place for the logged in user or for the place ID in the URL, which we actually try to do. So this won't work. Instead, I want to fetch the place data from the backend because that is a common requirement, that you have a single page with details about some entity in your application and you want to fetch the latest data from the backend to display it there. Now, conveniently on the backend, we have a route for this. This get route where we then trigger get place by ID in the end. So now we just need to send a request to this URL from our frontend. So here I will import use HTTP client from shared hooks, HTTP hook, and just as before, initialize it here. So here I can use object destructuring thereafter, call HTTP client. And now we already have a isLoading state here. Let's get rid of that. This is now managed by our hook. So here we have isLoading, we have error, we have send request and clear error. All the things we already worked with. Now I want to send a request when this page loads to load the latest place data. For that we need use effect, which is already imported, and we will need use state to manage our loaded place data as well. So we'll add a state here, loaded place, and set loaded place, and manage this with use state, and initially that's undefined. Then here, instead of using our dummy places, I want to use effect to send a request and fetch my data. So here in use effect, I'll have send request as a dependency, and I'll also have the place ID, which we get from the URL as a dependency. And in that function, I now want to fetch a place here. So just as before, I'll add a fetch place function in here so that I can conveniently use async await and call fetch place immediately thereafter. And in fetch place, we can now send a request, await the response, and there we got our response data. And here, of course, we need to provide a URL on that request. The URL is http localhost 5000/API/places, and now if you verify this on the backend, /someplaceid. So here we simply inject the place ID we got from the URL. This should get us a place. Of course, for whatever reason, this could fail though, so let's actually catch any errors. We don't need to handle them here though, because we do have error handling built into our custom HTTP client hook. And therefore, here we just need to worry about the success case. If I got my places, I can call setLoadedPlace. And now on the backend, if we have a look at the places controller, we see that getPlaceById in the end returns an object with a place key, which contains that loaded place. So here, we want to set the loaded place to response data.place. So this will fetch a place. Now, whenever we fetch a place, we also want to update our form data, right? Before we did this here with the identified place, now we can actually grab this setFormData call here, remove this entire use effect call down there, and instead not just set the loaded place, but actually set form data, and here use response data.place.title, response data.place.description. That just means that we should add set form data as a dependency here. Now with that, we're updating the form correctly. We're storing our loaded place. Now down there, we need to check if we got a loaded place, because if we don't, then I want to render this fallback. Otherwise, if we're loading, I'll render this. Though we can do better now, actually. We can use a loading spinner here. Make sure you add the import at the top, and you import loading spinner from shared components UI elements loading spinner. And whilst we're there already, we can import error modal from shared components UI elements error modal as well, so that we can also output errors. So now we got that imported. And if we now scroll down, we're rendering our loading spinner here if we are loading. And if we're not loading and we got a place, then here I want to return React fragment. so that I can also again use my error modal here and render error modal like this, forward the error which we get, and point on clear at the clear error function. And of course, you could also, just as before, check is loading here and output a loading spinner here if you wanted to. I just also want to show this alternative of doing this in an extra if statement. Now, one extra tweak I want to apply here is I want to check if we don't have a loaded place and we're not having an error, then I want to show this fallback. Otherwise, we should make it to this block here. And if we now save this, let's give it a try. Let's authenticate here. Log in, and now click on edit, and there you saw could not find place briefly before this is loaded. However, the form is definitely not initialized correctly here, and the reason for seeing could not find a place is that I check is loading too late. I should do this before I check if we're maybe not loading anymore, but we got no place in error, so I should have this order here. But the reason for the form being empty is a different one. We're simply rendering the form too early, and therefore the input gets initialized too early. Here I want to check if we're not loading and we got a loaded place. And only in that case I will render the form. With that added, if we now save this and we log in again, go to our place here and edit it, and we're still not seeing our initial values here. Now we can fix this by changing our logic here in the form a bit more. I'm checking if we're not loading and if we have the loaded place. Now actually, we can also use that loaded place, which we know will have the initial data from the backend, to set our initial title here and set this initial validity to true therefore. And down there we can set this to loaded place.description and setting this to true, and that should do the trick. If we now save that, we log in real quick again. We go to edit here. Now this is initialized correctly. Now briefly, you see the loading spinner there, because our data of course arrives super quick here in this application. And then here we have our data. Now let's make sure that we don't just load the data we want to edit, but that we actually also are able to change it and then click update place and store it on a backend. Now to store our update on the backend, we got a specific route, of course. In the places routes, we got this patch route where we just need to point at API/places/place ID, and where we then add the title and description to the body of that request. So on the front end, in update place.js in the places pages folder, we want to trigger that whenever we in the end submit this form. So here, this will now be an async function so that I can use async await in there. And then here we want to send a request. We want to send a request to the backend. Now, just as before, I will use backticks here so that we can easily inject data into this string. And we'll point at localhost 5000/API/places/the ID of that place, which of course is place ID, the value we already have available here, which we're extracting from our frontend route, from our frontend URL. Now, this is not a default request, so we need to add a second argument where we set patch instead of the default of get. I want to add a body, and this has to be stringified data, so JSON data. And there we should have our new title, which we get from form state, inputs, title value, and the new description, which is form state, inputs, description value. And last but not least, let's also add our headers here. And there, you know, we need to add this content type application JSON header for the backend to parse the incoming data correctly. We can then await this and wrap it in try catch to make sure that we only continue in the success case. So here I catch any potential errors, but I don't do anything with it. And then here in try, I await the response. I'm not too interested in the response actually, because I just want to redirect the user if we have a success response. So for that, from the React Router DOM package, we can import the use history hook, which we already used before. and then use it here to create such a history object, which then gives us all these functions to move the user around in the front-end navigation. And use history here after awaiting for our response. Here after awaiting for our response, call history, and then maybe push to /nothing. And it's up to you to which route you want to redirect. Actually, here it maybe makes more sense to redirect to the overview of places. And for that, we need the user ID, because we get to that places per user overview page by encoding the user ID in the URL. And to get that user ID, we need to tap into our context, because that is where we manage our user ID of the logged in user. And for that, we also need to import auth context from shared context auth context. And then here in update place, maybe right at the start, we can tap into this context by using use context and pointing at auth context. And now with that, we get this auth object. And when we want to redirect, we redirect at /, then the user ID, and then /nothing was it, right? If we check app.js, all places are loaded for user ID /places, actually, of course. So /places at the end. With that, if we save this, this should actually already be all. If we go to our application and we log in real quick, and I go to my places and I added this and add exclamation marks here, a great place in Munich, definitely worth a visit. And I click update place, we see the loading spinner, and then we are redirected. So this definitely works, and you see the changes reflected here. And of course, also reflected if I reload, right? Then it's still there. We are logged out now, but it's still there. So this worked just fine, and we are now able to update places as well. So let's finish this up by now making sure we can also delete places.